Okay, let's go ahead and try this. I think I've got it worked out. We'll do chapter 7. And pretty much talk about movies. And again, this is the movie chapter. So it's one of my favorites. And we pretty much, first thing we kind of mention would be that the Disney Corporation, which has had a lot of acquisitions over the past few years, they started out with, in 2006, Disney bought Pixar for about 7.6 billion. Up, Toy Story, Monsters University, Inside Out, Coco, The Incredibles. So all those went to Disney. And then 2009, Disney bought Marvel for about 3.96 billion. So they did the Avengers, Iron Man 3, the Guardians of the Galaxy, Thor, Ragnarok, Black Panther, Avengers, Infinity War. That was a big deal when they took over Marvel. And in 2012, Disney bought Lucasfilm for about $4 billion. And it's really made a big deal in terms of all the Star Wars related products and the movies, games, the theme parks, the merchandise. Think of all the things that Disney has incorporated even into Disney World. They've got the Star Wars section down there now. So they really did buy the rights, and it made a huge difference. So how did this all get started? And basically, development of film really was one of the first things that led to movies. So again, the milestones were one of the first types of movie was Muybridge, was the first project moving pictures. I think he had one of a horse running. The other big event was Eastman Kodak. And again, I went to school in New York at RIT, so I'm very familiar with the George Eastman House and the Kodak plant that was up there in the 1890s. And Eastman developed the first roll film. And the idea was that you bought a camera, it had roll film in it. And when you took your so many pictures that it had on a roll, you sent it back to Kodak, to the factory, and then they sent you the pictures in another camera. So it was a pretty interesting monopoly they had going on with the film. Film was improved by Goodwin. And again, celluloid was added. And this is the thin strips of transparent pliable material that held the coating of light sensitive chemicals. Prior to that, we used glass plates to coat them with light sensitive crystals and chemicals. So this really made a big difference from going to roll film, as opposed to, it allowed us to pursue the attempt to make movies, because then the film was actually flexible. So Thomas Edison was also involved, his assistant, William Kennedy Dickinson. Again, all this was running parallel with the recording of phonographs and sound and telephone. All the stuff sort of ran together in terms of the inventions at that time. So it had the kinesgraph, combined incandescent light bulb, celluloid, and camera. The kinescope had a single person viewing system that you could look through. And the vitascope was a large screen viewing system. So all these really took place in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Lumiere brothers invented the cinematograph, and Lumiere brothers were famous European inventors that also helped fast forward the development of movies. So how did the movies really start off? Again, it was silent. So they were silent movies. And sort of the introduction of narrative. So if you study any English or literature or anything like that, you realize that movies really paralleled books, and a lot of the things that they did really were based on books at the time. So it really shifted movies to the mass medium stage. And again, we had early narrative filmmakers. George Méliès did The Vanishing Lady and Cinderella and A Trip to Moon. I showed The Trip to Moon a little bit in class. And again, these were silent, so they would have a background music with it, some sort of piano or something would accompany it. Edward S. Porter was also famous for The Life of American Fireman and The Great Train Robbery. That was one of the first ones too. And all these ended up being played in a form of a movie theater, which was the Nickelodeon. And again, we all know that from your cartoon channel from years. But again, it was a form of a movie theater. It combined the name of the admission price with the Greek word for theater. So again, it was a nickel to get in Nickelodeon, and they often were converted to storefronts. They had live music by piano players, and really did transcend language barriers, because a lot of immigrants in the United States. This was way before we ever had any type of subtitles or anything. So it really did peak by 1910, and again, it was very popular at its time frame. So again, how did Hollywood really come about? And that was the the rise of the Hollywood studio, and you can see from historical context that Edison was involved about everything back then, and Edison developed a trust. There was a cartel of major US and French producers and making films, and they had a deal with Eastman Kodak in terms of the film. So that was one of the things that they really didn't have rights to buy the film from Kodak. So that made a huge difference for them. So at some point, people who were independent, who weren't part of this trust, they wanted to move their productions to Hollywood to get away from it. Zucker was one of them. And Zucker, his early companies figured out ways to get around the trust. And eventually there was a suit by Fox, which led up to this breakup of the trust. Again, this was the time frame in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, that a lot of these big corporations, monopolies, and the context that was going on is that everything was big business in the Industrial Revolution. So monopolies were the thing at that point, if you read your history. So also the Hollywood studio system that had entrepreneurs like Zucker, they developed other tactics for controlling the industry. Again, this is a big one, this vertical integration. It was dominating at all three essential levels. So the idea was they could do take control of production, distribution, and exhibition. So it became an oligopoly in terms of that few firms did control the bulk of the business. And this spawning of this happened by the vertical integration, giving the studio powers. They had a lot of power by owning all three aspects of the movie production. So it was, from its heyday, really pretty much a monopoly, and we still face a lot of those issues today. So the production really started about with the actors were anonymous, and eventually the industry came around and decided that it might be a good idea to establish stars, and so one of the stars was Mary Pickford. And Mary Pickford became so famous that eventually she helped elevate the status of the financial status of the actors, so they got paid more. And finally, she left Zucker's employ to form United Artists, which was a conglomeration of artists who wanted to escape the assembly line of the studio production system. So it really was a process that whoever worked for those, they were more or less like robots in a sense, because they had exclusive contracts from major studios. They couldn't go shop from one place to the other. And again, they pretty much lived and died by whatever the studio told them to do. So they did control the creative talent in the industry. And again, this was pioneered by Thomas Ince and his company Triangle. So again, that eventually they moved away from this. Actors became more powerful, but during the early stages of movie making, they were not. So the distribution was another big thing. The film exchange system, movie companies received a percentage of the ticket gate receipts in exchange for short films. So this block booking came about, where it was a distribution strategy, where exhibitors had to rent marginal films in order to get the films that had the big stars in it. So it enabled studios to test market new stars with minimal risk. And again, eventually it was outlawed too as monopoly or monopolistic. And again, the other thing that added to the mix is the marketing of American films in Europe. And that really did sort of create an atmosphere that Hollywood still dominates the world market in terms of movie making today. So all this goes back to the 1900s. And the other thing they tried to do was control the exhibition or the theaters. And at Edison's trust, they required the theaters to purchase license or be locked out of getting the movies they wanted. So Zucker decided to counter that, and they bought up theaters. So they developed movie palaces that were full-time single-screen movie theaters, often more hospitable movie-going environment. They were plush. They were really cool. Cincinnati had a couple of them downtown that were fantastic. The other thing they did is build mid-city movie theaters that were in convenient locations near the mass transit stations, going towards the urban and suburban middle class people would be able to go to them. And eventually, way down the road to movie making, is we did have multiple screens at the multiplexes, but that wasn't really till later. That we're close to Interstate Highway Crossroads, that type of thing. That wasn't really until about the 60s and 70s. So this exhibition part, again, who is the powerful oligopoly that owns all the movie making facilities and process, would be the big five, which is the Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, and RKO. And a lot of these have not changed over the years. They've been absorbed back and forth on who owns what. But the little three were Columbia, Universal, and United Artists, which they did not own their own theaters. So the people that owned their own theaters did better than the ones that didn't. And again, not owning it, it made it difficult for independent companies to make and distribute and exhibit commercial films. So they really did sort of close down the system in terms of who got what. So the silent era and the Hollywood narrative, really the big directors and that were important was D.W. Griffith was one. He was the single most important director in the early days. He did The Birth of a Nation, which was a feature-length film. It was a blockbuster at the time. However, it was seen today. There are a lot of racial overtones to that and aspects, and I think there's actually a Klan march in it. So it's seen as sort of a seminal type of movie that was put forth to the public, but really in today's mindset, it would be viewed a lot differently than it was when it first came out. So the other popular silent era films would have been Napoleon, Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments. Those were all pretty famous at that time. And finally, we did get the talkies coming in. The introduction of sound was really in about the, again, mid-20s. And the early attempts to try to put sound with moving pictures failed in the 1890s. But finally, around 1927, The Jazz Singer came out and The Singing Fool. Those were the first successful talkies. And prior to that, Movietone, Fox's newsreel company, had put out newsreels that had first film footage with sound. So it included aspects like Lindbergh's Takeoff and Return. And again, the sound film came out about 5 months before The Jazz Singer. So we really did have sound around 1926, 1927. So how did Hollywood develop a style? And again, these were the Hollywood narratives. Two basic components. They would have story and then the discourse. So then they tried to come up with genres, which was a category which would have similar characters, scenes, structures, themes reoccur over and over again in combination. So the idea behind that was to achieve the goal of product standardization and product differentiation. So some of the popular ones, and this holds true today, the genres are still in existence, would be action, adventure, mystery, suspense, fantasy, science fiction, the musicals, westerns, comedies, drama, romance, horror, gangster, film noir, which is the cinema verite type. And again, everybody today still has their own favorite genre that we like to watch. And again, this all stems from back in the early days of Hollywood when they first started. So I still lean towards science fiction, which even the early science fiction ones were pretty cool. So development of the Hollywood style, there were Hollywood authors, and again, this particular cinematic style or topic, a lot of it in the 70s came from Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider and George Lucas's American Graffiti, which were two very, very popular movies when I was in high school. And this new wave of directors that came about from that era, again, most of them did go to the University of Southern California, the film school there. I actually looked at that once to go to graduate school there. But it was Francis Ford Coppola, Scorsese, Spielberg, and Brian De Palma, and they were all sort of at the beginning of the big blockbusters that really came about in the 70s and 80s. However, at that point, they didn't have very many women and minorities in terms of directors or being in the production roles, so that did change as time came about too. So when we get outside of the Hollywood system, we think of global cinema. A lot of countries did have a history of producing films. Germany was one, Sweden, some of the others. Today, India with Bollywood. But a lot of the stuff was really documentary. They would interpret reality by recording actual people. So the early forms were really interest films, newsreel, travel logs. A lot of that stuff would require the backing of an industry or government or philanthropy to cover costs. During World War II, there was a lot of propaganda films. Germany and did that. And actually, the United States did to a certain extent in terms of used films as a prop for the war. There is no question. The other thing that really happened was the cinema verite, which is French for truth film. It was made possible by portable cameras, and it aimed to track reality. It looked rough and grainy and shaky, and it was handheld, and it really was seen as sort of a, and again, I immediately think of Blair Witch, or I think of the Cloverfield, which are the two that really try to still mimic that today. So outside the system, also we had independents or independently produced films. They usually were made on the cheap. They were shown in small venues, film festivals. And again, the festivals were important for discovering new talent, and they would be seen as a feeder system for the major studios until it sort of declined today when we're going to streaming movies and that. But again, Sundance out in Utah, and then Cannes Film Festival, a lot of those were seen as places where film is shown first to see if it would be actually embraced by the public. So it's sort of a distribution route that really helps in terms of for the indies. It's still in existence, but it's not as big as it was in the 60s and 70s, because sometimes you'd have a movie that broke out at a film festival and everybody thought it was really cool. So the other thing that really happened in the mid 50s would have been the McCarthy hearings and the whole hunt for communists across the country. And again, the HUAC investigated subversive and communist ties. So a lot of the writers were Jewish, and the Hollywood 10 is part of this whole mix that they were 9 screenwriters, 1 producer. They refused to identify whether they were communist sympathizers. And again, this was during the McCarthy era. So they were charged with contempt and in prison. They were blacklisted by major studios upon their release. This really was sort of a pivotal point in terms of, in the 50s, of sort of the idea that the studio system controlled who worked for them. And again, if they didn't meet the criterion of the current political climate, they were more or less punished. And it was not a good thing at the time. It did not happen well in terms of for the Hollywood 10. So the other thing that happened was the Paramount decision, which was Supreme Court forced studios to divest themselves of their theaters. The idea was to increase competition. It didn't really change the oligopoly structure of the Hollywood film industry. We still had several major players. It did create opportunities for exhibition, though. So we started to get the art houses or film movie theaters that actually showed more independent films. And then drive-in theaters came about too, which was another thing, was sort of the 60s, 50s, and 60s that they came about. And again, the other thing that happened in the 50s is that we moved from a wartime economy to consumer production that had a big impact on movie going. So the money spent on consumer products, instead of going to the movies, people married younger, so fewer couples were dating. And again, the television explosion in the late 50s really changed the movie industry, because it did have to adapt. So how did television really change Hollywood? Again, TV became the primary entertainment by the mid 50s. Again, the industry tried to respond. They tried to do more serious subject matter that explored social problems. Again, they pushed out new technologies: Cinerama, CinemaScope, VistaVision, 3D, Panavision. They weren't necessarily failed attempts, but they didn't really create the fervor that, people thought it was cool, but still, it was a special event to go to a CinemaScope movie down in Cincinnati. They didn't really have them in the suburbs here during the 50s and into the early 60s. But it kind of reminded me of IMAX today, the same kind of deal, that if you got to go to the CinemaScope, and they did charge a little bit more for it too. So how did Hollywood adapt to the home entertainment movement? Again, cable and videos, cassettes in the 70s changed how movies were exhibited. Again, the video market really was a big bonanza for the movie industry, because people bought the movies too, there's no question. But it did, it was hot for a long time in terms of the rental market, but then finally that did decline. And the future of video rental obviously moved to where we're at today in terms of all the streaming and download. But for a long time in the 70s and 80s, I mean, it was huge in terms of the video market and how they made money by video cassettes. So the production and distribution and exhibition today, the studios make money from 6 sources of income. It would be the box office receipts, which right now is sort of in a downturn because of COVID, DVD sales, rentals, and downloads, and the downloads are huge. The pay-per-view and premium cable, again, foreign markets worldwide make a big difference. And again, distributing indie films, and then the licensing of products and putting products into movies is a big deal too. So they make money off that, the toys, all those things that come about. So there's still 5 companies that operate about 50% of the US screens right now. And again, a lot of them are these megaplexes, which facilities, they'd have 14 more screens. They were in the 1990s developed. And again, the IMAX screens and digital projectors. And digital was a big move too, because to go away from film and made a big difference in terms of quality. And again, they'd screen non-movie events at some of these places with live sports, concerts, classic TV. I never went to any of those, but I know they did it for fights and stuff. And then IMAX is testing these VR centers, which are 12-foot by 12-foot pods. I have not ever experienced that. I don't know how that's really worked out. I've never seen that, as a matter of fact. So here's, I think this is 2015, the top all-time box office champions. In class, I showed a better video, which I'll probably find and post online here. But again, Star Wars was up there. The Force Awakens was about almost $1 billion. Avatar is up there. Black Panther, Titanic, Jurassic. This is subject to change too, because if you go into 2020, this list rotates up and down on which one has made the most. But it's still Gone with the Wind in today's dollars, if you take inflation into account, has done over $2 billion. So it's still the biggest box office blockbuster of all time was still Gone with the Wind. So here's the major players again. Again, the big six would be the Warner Brothers, Paramount, 21st Century Fox, Universal, Columbia Pictures, and Disney. They account for more than 86% of the film revenues, which is a lot. And all of them are pretty much owned by large parent conglomerates except Disney and Fox. They all diversified in the 80s and had heavy promotion. So they have all the things they own, you know, television stations, radio, TV, all this is when we get into the whole conglomerate type of who owns what and convergence. So the synergy process, which really, again, also began sort of in the 80s, was a promotion and sale of products through various subsidiaries of the media conglomerate. So again, if they have radio, they have TV, they have this, they use that to promote their products, the movies, the toys, all that stuff. But again, a flood of the corporate mergers really has a hard, it gives you, take pause on who owns what now and how it's changed over the years, because there always seems to be some sort of merger and somebody taking over somebody. So the question is that good for the consumers or not? You can make an argument on that. So here's a little bit of this was 2015, so this is older data in terms of 5 years, but Disney had about 21% of the share. Time Warner had about 18%, Universal 15%, 21st Century Fox had 12, almost 13. Columbia, Sony had 9.8. So if you go around, you can see, and again, this pie chart does change over time too, because it's always in a state of flux, really. So the other part of convergence was the movies adjust to digital. And again, they embraced the internet distribution. We know Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, Apple TV, all that have really made a big difference. And again, even Redbox and Blockbuster video stores when they were out, and again, Redbox still does exist, Blockbuster, it does not. But it really made the turn to the, you know, things that are available in movies that are available on smartphones and tablets. So 2012 was really the turning point. That was the first year digital outpaced physical DVDs. And again, the internet really becomes essential for marketing. It's less expensive than traditional. And again, web pages and social media also play a role in terms of how it's marketed. And you'll see people, you know, making decisions on movie choices online via what friends say, word of mouth, all that kind of stuff really goes into it in terms of relating to the internet. The other thing that really happened was for the alternative voices, aside from the big studios, would be digital video has become cheaper and more accessible than standard film. So camera work can be seen instantly without film processing, which is great. A lot of the major directors have adopted it. It's the same format as DVD and internet video, so they can be distributed online easy. We do have video equipment that the libraries have at Miami that you can actually go out and make your own film. You can get access to FileMaker or to Final Cut, which is the Apple software for doing your own editing in terms of videos. And again, it's not that hard to learn that, to get in and get involved in it. It's so much easier now than when I took film at Miami back in 1976 or whatever it was, to make your own film and do editing and all that kind of stuff. It's fantastic in terms of the opportunities that you do have. So if you want to get into it, you can. So here's a little bit of the essay, part of the questions. The consensus narrative would be that do cultural products become popular and provided shared cultural experiences? So there's a big question is, since we're across different times and cultures, how much is Hollywood and our movie making affecting different times and different culture? Are we changing cultures? Are we making them better? Are we making them worse? Do they have a different view of what we are like as opposed to their experience in terms of culturally? So you really can make an argument, do US films contribute to a global village in which people share universal culture, or are we doing the opposite and we're stifling local culture and diversity? And you can make an argument both ways on that essay for sure, because a lot of people would say that then everybody assumes that but we are what our movies reflect us as, which sometimes I'm not quite sure I really believe that. But so that's it for chapter 7, and I'll probably move on to chapter 8.